So, Taoism is both a philosophy and a religious tradition that originated back in China in the 6th century BC. And the Tao, as the tradition teaches, is a term that can't really be defined, can't really be described. And in fact, the core of the teaching says that the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao. One way of exploring this idea of the Tao is that it points to this principle that is the source, that is the substance, and that is the pattern behind every single thing that is. The principle that is the source and pattern and substance behind every single thing that is. That sounds an awful lot like what Charles Fillmore is referring to. Unity co-founder Charles Fillmore is referring to when he talks about God. In our Unity text, God has often been referred to as pure principle, as invisible, infinite substance, as the source which is back of everything, that which simply is. And the goal of the path of the Tao is living in harmony with the Tao, sometimes interpreted in English as the way, living in harmony with what is. I bring up Taoism today because for me, the Taoist tradition has one of the most effective and powerful stories that illustrates the principle of forgiveness, in which I personally hold it. The idea behind what I think is the truest, the deepest form of forgiveness that can be had. So there's a story of a sage in which one day the sage calls upon his student or disciple. And the sage has with him a big empty sack as well as a massive basket of potatoes. So as he approaches his disciple, he says this, "Now, student, for this week, I'd like to instruct you or advise you to take one potato for each person who has offended you, harmed you, abused you in any way, spoken against you, or done anything against you in any way, and carve on one of these ripe potatoes the name of that person. So do that, please." And so the disciple did as instructed. And so he starts carving, one name after another. And he puts all of these potatoes in a basket. And then he lifts it and is like, I do a lot of chores. This ain't so bad. I can handle this. So he picks up the sack. And as his teacher tells him, for the week, he decides, okay, I'll do as instructed, and I'm going to carry this sack. The instructor said, be mindful. You need to carry this sack everywhere you go. Everywhere you go. And so the first day, the disciple carries the sack. It's not so bad. The second day, he notices, I haven't added any potatoes, but the sack feels a lot heavier than it did the day before. By the third day, the sack is not only heavy, but it seems to be getting in his way, and it's really inconvenient to be carrying the sack around everywhere with him. By the fourth day, the potatoes, which were a little on the ripe side to begin with, start to rot and fester, and it starts to stink. So everywhere this student goes, he stinks. And And so he's wandering around like, oh, I can't wait till 7 days so I can go back to my teacher, and be done with a sack of potatoes. So 7 days comes, he meets with his teacher, and his teacher looks at him and says, well, what have you learned? And the disciple, who's a very good student, pauses for a moment and says, well, when I refuse to forgive, it's like carrying around all this negativity everywhere I go. And after a little while, this negativity starts to become really heavy and becomes this burden. And it gets in my way. And after a time, it starts to rot and fester. And the master nods his head and says, exactly. And then he adds, well, how would you ease your burden? And the student thinks for a moment and says, well, I would strive to forgive. And the master again says, exactly. And the student looks pleased with himself. And the master then follows up and says, so of these people or these potatoes, which are you ready to forgive today? And the student, who had been actually pondering this all week, really sitting with it, sincerely said, recognizing how exhausting that was and how much negativity all of that unforgiveness caused in my life, I'm ready to forgive all of them. And so the master nods his head and says, wonderful. Then you can remove every single potato from that sack. The student was very delighted at this point, and so he starts removing all the potatoes from his sack and setting them aside. And as he's doing so, the master says, oh, but wait. During the past week, did anyone say or do anything to trespass against you that offended you or upset you? And the student said, yes. And the master said, well. And the student was then starting to get a little panicked and said, wait a minute. So are you saying that every week, even if I'm letting go of these potatoes, that every week I have to add new potatoes to my sack? And the master says, well, every time someone says or does something to offend you, then you must collect one potato. And the student is like, what's the point of the Tao if I have to do this every week? And the master pauses and says, wait a minute. We have not even begun to enter the realm of the Tao. What you and I have been talking about so far is conventional forgiveness. The forgiveness that is taught by many of the world's religious and spiritual traditions. Conventional forgiveness with the releasing of the potato. In conventional forgiveness, you must strive to forgive. And this is indeed a virtue, said the master. But in the Tao, there is no striving. And the student thought about it for a moment. But he felt very confused. How do I do this without striving? And the master then further explained by asking him another question. Now, if the potatoes are your negative feelings that are born of unforgiveness, then what is the sack? And after a moment, the student awakened, and he said, I get it now. The sack is that which is in me that holds on to the potatoes. The sack for me is my inflated sense of self. Today, as we explore the topic of forgiveness, I want to share with you how the practice of true forgiveness for me is a dual practice in my humanity. It is indeed a practice of letting go of the potatoes, but it is also a practice of letting go of the sack. So that's what I'd like to explore with you today in 3 parts. First, I want to remind us and explore the purpose and the benefits of this process of forgiveness that is so deeply powerful and uplifting. Second, I want to explore what I mean by true forgiveness, what it means to me to truly forgive, not just in the conventional sense, but from this deeper spiritual perspective. And then finally, I'd like to explore with you the process of forgiveness as I personally practice it, knowing that there are many different ways that we can practice forgiveness. And I'll simply share my way today in hopes that it will give you. So first, why? Second, what? Third, how? So why forgive? All of the world's key religious and spiritual traditions talk about the spiritual importance of forgiveness, but it's really only been in the last several decades that modern science has taken a hold of this. And out at Stanford University, there's something called the Stanford Forgiveness Project, which has been studying forgiveness and the actual real-life human benefits of this practice of forgiveness. And so they say that forgiveness is immensely valuable to us in that when people start to consciously practice forgiveness, a whole list of physical ailments that were previously inexplicable start to move away. It alleviates our stress. Predominantly, one of the things that they found that I thought was so striking is that when these people started to practice forgiveness, they had fewer heart problems. And it struck me how forgiveness is a practice of the heart and of healing the heart, literally as well as symbolically. Forgiveness builds our immune system. We're sick less often. They say you develop more of an appetite, though I don't know if that's a good thing, right? Like eating more, a better appetite, better sleeping patterns. There's lots of physical benefits to forgiveness. If you've been in unity for a while, you might also be aware that in consciousness, forgiveness is taught as a core practice for if you have been praying for a while and you feel like your prayers are ineffective. The invitation is to look at where in your heart you harbor unforgiveness, because as the music has shared with us today, there's this idea that the flow of love that is natural to us, that is the essence of our being, is stopped when we refuse to forgive. We stop the flow of love. And so the flow of goodness in life is stopped not just for the other person, but also for ourselves. And so even for selfish reasons, if you will, even for personal reasons, the recognition that forgiveness gets us back into the flow. Of course, from a unity perspective, we believe that our nature is to love. And so to remember our true nature, we must forgive. And there's a benefit of that where we get back into contact with the flow of love in our lives. Every unity prosperity teacher has taught that if we are praying for greater prosperity, one of the key things that we need to do is forgive. And I want to share a wonderful quote by Charles Fillmore, co-founder of the Unity Movement, on the topic on the importance of forgiveness to our health and well-being. He says, "Here is a mental treatment guaranteed to cure every ill that flesh is heir to. Sit for a half hour every night and mentally forgive everyone against whom you have had any ill will or antipathy." And of course, from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 11, verse 25, "And when you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive them." Forgiveness, for those of you who study the law of attraction, it's the idea that if we're failing to forgive, then we're not vibrating at the level of good and of love. So no wonder that doesn't call to us, right? We don't magnetize that which we are not. So that's important to remember for our well-being. Dr. Ernest Holmes wrote, "Life intends and wants to give us every good thing. What we refuse to give, though, we refuse to accept. And nothing is more important than that we learn how to forgive both ourselves and others." So the purpose of forgiveness, the flow of love and well-being in our lives. But what do we actually mean by forgiveness? The thing about it is, despite the many benefits of forgiveness, despite that most practices and spiritual traditions advise toward forgiveness, if you're anything like me, forgiveness can sometimes still be quite a challenge. And so it was helpful for me to read this passage by Frederick Luskin, Dr. Frederick Luskin, who leads the Stanford Forgiveness Project. He says that much of our struggle to forgive is actually based on misconceptions about what forgiveness actually means. So for most of us, we don't forgive because there's some part of us that thinks that if I forgive you, I'm condoning your behavior. I'm endorsing it, right? And this is a reminder that we can be a fountain of love towards someone without condoning who they are, what their life choices are, right? But we don't need to restrict the flow of love within ourselves simply because of another person's choices. The other misconception that's common is that to forgive, we must also forget. And I always thought this was rather strange because it's like a selective, right? Like a selective forgetting. Like, oh no, I just blocked that out of my memory. So he says that's not true. We don't need to forget in order to open our heart to really the fullness of the love that we already are. And then some of us think, especially if we've been wrapped up in kind of enmeshed relationships, that we think that forgiveness means we must reconcile with the person, right? That we need to confront the person, make sure there's harmony between us, and that we must reconcile or even stay with someone. But it's important to recognize that that's not what forgiveness means. It doesn't mean that if someone is abusing you in any way, that you need to stay with that person. You can get as far as you would like and still send love. Be a vessel for love for that person. So these are things that even if we consciously or intellectually know it, I know for me, the habit I get into the most is sort of my tendency to be a little bit righteous in the world, like I'm a good person, and this, and that, like, I see when someone does something I think is morally wrong, I hold this, look of unforgiveness as if somehow my condemnation is going to fix things, but I have this idea, and then I realize, oh no, it just causes me strain and tension and wrinkles, really, so it's not really about the other person. But there's a part of us that gets linked into that. And so the remembrance that forgiveness is really an inner act that we do in our own being, and that's important. So if these things are not forgiveness, then what is true forgiveness? So for me, the most profound, transformative, and healing form of forgiveness comes from the teachings of A Course in Miracles. And I'm going to take a step back to bring you back to the story of the sack. So in the story that comes from Taoism, the student says, oh, the sack is my inflated sense of self. And so the work is to release that inflated sense of self. But I'm reminded of a story often told by my dear friend and colleague, Reverend Robert Brummett, when he talks about Buddhism. And he says this, which is like, in a Buddhist class, a student might come up and say, especially in our modern day, when psychology is merged with Buddhism, they come up and say, can Buddhist teachings help my low self-esteem? And the Buddhist teacher nods and says, yes. It can also help your high self-esteem. And so the idea is that they're both the same in a sense. They come from what I would call a sense of self that is false, or the false self. What do I mean by the false self? If I truly believe that we are one, there is only one power and one presence active in our lives and in the universe, God the good, in all, through all, and over all. Maybe call it the Tao, the oneness. That whenever I have carved anything as higher than or lower than, I have separated this from the equality of the oneness. So, true forgiveness is losing my false belief in a separate self. True forgiveness is losing this false belief in my separate self so that I can remember this place in me, this truth that is about me that cannot be harmed. From A Course in Miracles, a few core teachings I want to share with you. First is the idea that was revolutionary to me when I first heard it, which is, you, Nhien, it's like it was talking to me, you are not angry for the reason you think. And here I was thinking, no, there are very obvious reasons why what someone did at work, what my partner did at home, what my parents did to me, are the reasons why I'm angry. So at first, this was very confusing for me to hear. But then A Course in Miracles goes on and says, you are not angry for the reason you think. That behind all the ways in which we project reasons to be angry out there, these ways are rooted in a deep belief that we are guilty, that some moment in time we actually effectively separated from the whole. We left God, if you will, and we believe, oh shoot, like we did this and we're out here on our own. And there's a lot of guilt that comes from this separate self acting out here, and there's a lot of fear, and anger covers over that fear. And so The healing act in A Course in Miracles is to first recognize that the object of our unforgiveness isn't actually out there, but that our feelings are rooted in a deep sense of separation from the oneness of life in here. There's a wonderful passage from A Course in Miracles on this topic. It says, "What is forgiveness? Forgiveness recognizes what you thought your brother did to you has not occurred. It does not pardon sins and make them real. It sees there was no sin. And in that view are all your sins forgiven. What is sin except a false idea? Forgiveness merely sees its falsity and therefore lets it go. What then is free to take its place is now the will of God." In Dynamics for Living, Charles Fillmore wrote, "Forgiveness is a process of giving up the false for the true, erasing sin and error from the mind and body." So, true forgiveness, for me, in its sort of ultimate level, is a process of remembering that if I feel offended, irritated, betrayed, wronged, then I've come to believe in a false notion not only of myself, but of you, of my brothers and my sisters. That I don't know our oneness. And at root, I believe something that is fundamentally untrue. And I'm reminded of the preface to A Course in Miracles, which many of you already know. This mantra that helps me to practice forgiveness. Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. What is real in you? What is real about me cannot be victimized, cannot be diminished, cannot be truly hurt. When I experience the human feeling of that, instead of going to the ways now in which I can justify my feelings of hurt, I remember that as a sign that I am not awake in this moment. I'm not awake to the truth of being. So then all forgiveness opportunities become opportunities to remember the truth of being. Which leads to my third point, that it's not always easy, and that the process is much more jagged than just simply, oh, I know this truth and the truth will set me free, right? But it's often dual. It takes me every week realizing, like last week, why am I unusually depressed and lethargic and listless this week? Oh, I have an unusual number of potatoes in my sack, right? I wanted to bring you baby potatoes to share. I was like, that's not realistic. Mine are kind of big, little baby potatoes. But really, in that moment, it didn't feel funny at all, right? In that moment, you just feel tired, miserable. And I realized, oh, I've forgotten. Here I am going, if they only did that right, I would be happy and things would be so much better. But remembering this truth, I'm like, oh, I have bought into a false self. So we start over there. But the invitation is to go to the remembrance of the truth. Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of the Tao. Right? And so what are the practices that can support us in this? In the moment where I recognize my unforgiveness, it's very important to remember that we cannot heal what we do not let ourselves feel. So we don't want to do a spiritual bypass by saying, oh, I'm pissed, and I'm angry, and I'm disillusioned, but oh, I'm going to be higher than thou over here and practice forgiveness. That usually just quenches it. Instead, if we take this motive and we let those feelings move through us, but we understand that that is not the truth of us. We let the hurt flow through us. We don't hold on to it. We don't tell stories to add to it, but we do let it move through us almost as a sensation. And then we can invite in a truth idea that I am love, whole and perfect, one with God, one with reality, one with life, that in truth, nothing real in me has ever been hurt or threatened by them, but only my idea of myself has been. So I take that opportunity, and I want to close by sharing another practice that I will do, not always out loud, but whenever a situation comes up during the week and I need spot treatment, I'll apply the Ho'oponopono practice, which comes from the Hawaiian tradition, popularized by Dr. Len, but he didn't actually originate it. And it's just 4 sentences. And this is the way that I practice it. Whenever something comes forward that upsets me, and admittedly this week it was a lot more things than usual, right? Whenever something comes up, I regard it and I do this prayer, recognizing that I'm not actually saying this to the perceived offender. I'm really saying this to the little me, as the higher self speaking to the little me, the true self, the divine self. And I say, I apologize. Please forgive me. I love you. And thank you. You could do that in different orders. Some people just say, thank you. I love you. There is magic in this process, because what it does is it reminds us of the truth of our nature, which is love. Unforgiveness only blocks us from the good of that knowing. And so I'll conclude today with simply that reminder again, and I'll say it in this order. And maybe I'll invite you to share it with me and repeat after me. So, I apologize.
I apologize.
Please forgive me.
Please forgive me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I love you. And so it is. Amen.